Our topic for today is more or less giving you a better sense of how things are built. If you come across a street that looks like this, chances are it's already too late for you to have any impact or any say on how that street gets put back together. Planning for all the streets and public spaces around us often takes quite a long time. So we want to better understand how that process works so that we don't get to this point where you come across a street and think, oh, gee, I really wonder if that street's going to be put back to be better for biking. Now, I should say that this is a very deep topic. We're going to sort of stay at the surface level, but give you just about everything that you need to have a good and productive impact. So talking about sort of that transportation process, how that transportation planning process, how things start from an idea and move over to a construction project like this, it more or less breaks down into 4 rough steps. And this is what they look like. You start with, sometimes it's 3 steps. You start with a plan, you do some design work, and then you build, plan, design, build. Sometimes there's a more detailed plan that starts before you plan. But essentially, especially in our area that really loves making plans, typically you're starting with a very detailed sort of master plan of a region, looking at all sorts of streets and how people use them, and making long-term plans for 20, 25 years. And that'll often go into a master plan. To actually put that master plan into practice, it's typically broken up into tiny, tiny projects, often looking at one street at a time, or maybe one small area at a time. And that's what we would call more of a planning study, looking at a particular piece of that overall plan and trying to implement it. Over time, as each step goes, you're getting more detailed. So a planning study, once the decision is made, like, okay, yes, we have enough detail here to know what the next steps are, you'll start going into more of a design phase where you're looking at the intricate details of a particular street, figuring out what can fit there, and how it can be repurposed. And then finally, once all of that is done, finally, you'll break ground and actually get something on its way to being built. The important thing to know here is not all of the intricacies of what happens in each of these steps, though we will be reviewing that at a later session, I think June 23rd. The important thing to know is that at each of these steps along this sort of study, design, build process are opportunities for folks like you, folks like me, to weigh in, to give input on what the best outcome is for walking and biking and great trails and great sustainable mobility. Okay, so really at every step of this, you have an opportunity to speak up until we get to that build step. I should also say it'd be helpful to know who all is on the line here. So if you wouldn't mind, find that chat in the bottom of your screen and throw down your name and where you're from, because I think that'll be helpful. I suspect that many of our folks will be from DC, but go ahead and throw down your name and where you're joining us from. Wonderful. Excellent. Y'all have found that chat box. Okay. So also, if you hear some banging around me, I apologize. Some things can't be planned, but all right. So today we're talking about how we give input. What are the ways that we can, get involved in some of these projects? And in particular, we're going to be talking about probably the most exciting. I say that with a wink. The most exciting of these, but certainly the most impactful, which is written comments and sort of participating in the bureaucratic process. I'm not pretending that this is the only way to influence a project. In fact, there are many, 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 many ways, and we'll be talking about sort of different tactics for 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 improving a street at future trainings. This one is purely focused on what can we do sort of inside the process, following the steps that our government's planners and elected decision makers get to step through. Okay, so talking about, wonderful, looks like we have a lot of folks in DC, which is fantastic. So much of this will be very relevant to you all. Thanks for chiming in. So when we talk about each step of that process has opportunities for input. The basic takeaway is that agency staff, these are folks working for your Department of Transportation. In DC, that's DDOT. In other jurisdictions, Arlington, it may be the Department of Environmental Services. Montgomery County, it's the Montgomery County Department of Transportation. At every step, there are opportunities for input, and agency staff really do want to hear from you. Looking at it somewhat cynically, in some cases, the rules that they operate under actually say you have to. But more importantly, they wanna hear from you because you can help get buy-in for this project and help you and your neighbors feel ownership for any kind of change to streets. It can help, getting input from you can help identify community needs and issues. If you are aware of an issue, it's much easier to solve it. And input from you and your neighbors also helps, ensure that any changes that are happening actually work for everybody. For years and years and years and years, a lot of the planning that was done was only thinking about how can we move people in cars faster or with less friction. And very often that meant ignoring the needs of people walking and biking, which is why the world around us looks much like it does. So we have a role to play there. But that's sort of what the agencies need and why the agencies might want to talk to you. Certainly, you have some reasons that you might want to weigh in as well. First and foremost, it makes a record participating in this sort of project planning process at any one of those steps. It makes a record of your opinion. It says, it's a record that you were there, and these are often tabulated in ways to get a sense of where public opinion is, or to justify decisions at later stages. You'll often see, pie charts and literally tallies of comments. 1,000 people said this, and 2,000 people weighed in this way, which can make future steps much easier. You speaking up gives the project team your context, your priorities, and sort of what's important to you. In many cases, while transportation planners are pretty smart, they may not live in the neighborhood that they're sort of doing a project in, so they don't really know what's happening on the ground or what folks are seeing day to day. And really, this is your chance to improve a plan to make sure that it suits your needs and the needs of your neighbors. In some other contexts, you speaking up is actually a chance to change sort of the tone and the direction of a discussion in a room. That's more so the case when there's an actual room where people are meeting in. But you can also make an impression on the project team, especially if they're heading in a different direction than is best for the community. That's your chance to change it. And really, without speaking up, you're just not participating. You're not influencing that planning process. You can sit on the street corner and complain as much as you like about how something is still a problem, but without speaking up and getting your sort of opinion and comments on the record, you may not actually have any effect there. Okay. So just very quickly, like, this is not the focus of it, but there's a lot of ways you can give input. You can go to public meetings. There's often pop-up outreach like metro stations and busy places. There may be online surveys. There may be interactive maps. even testimony at public hearings for some more official processes. The commonality between all of these is that all of those opportunities are a use for good written comments. And of course, written comments can turn into verbal comments and other things. So good written comments is a big focus. Well, I should say, yeah. So what we're talking about now is really a very specific kind of written comment. But let's say you've identified your project, you've been keeping an eye on what's going on, maybe you've been participating along the way. In DC, eventually, once you get from that plan, design, once you get to the very last step before build, DDOT will issue something called a notice of intent. It is a very official letter saying, heads up, we're planning on doing something. It's very easy to sweep these aside and say, like, this is not actually all that important. But this is the very last step that the city has to take before they actually break ground on a project. So what is a notice of intent? There's an example of one on the top left, but basically it's an official heads up. By law, DDOT has to notify a community before they make any changes to modify traffic or modify parking or exactly how public space is used on streets. So it's an official heads up to you. And what follows from that heads up is also an opportunity for you to give one last, to weigh in one last time. You get 30 business days or so. Even more specific to DC, this is also the Advisory Neighborhood Commission's last opportunity to weigh in. And their decision there can often be very important. ANCs by law are given great weight in decisions over what happens in their jurisdiction or in their particular area. So that's sort of what a notice of intent is. A little more specifically on maybe what it looks like and what would be contained in it. Very simply, it's a letter explaining what DDOT intends to do. They'll tell you what they're planning on doing. We're going to remove parking on one side of the street from this street to this street. They'll tell you when and sort of the reasons behind it. They'll often include a diagram of and plans so that you can actually better understand what they're talking about. Very often they'll include the actual plans, like the construction plans, or in a simplified way that can make it easier for a layperson to take it apart. They'll give you a name and an email address, somebody to actually send comments to. It's important to send those comments to the right person. And you'll also get a deadline. Typically it's 30 business days, though sometimes it's a little bit longer because DC business days will not include federal holidays or DC holidays, but they'll typically tell you the date. And as of, well, up to a year ago, these are actually often pretty hard to find. If you weren't specifically a sort of registered stakeholder in a neighborhood, these letters would go out by mail, sometimes by email, but they wouldn't go to everybody. They wouldn't go to someone who just lives in a place. It would go to an advisory neighborhood commissioner or a particular stakeholder. Now it's quite easy to find them. There's a website here. It's sort of DDOT's wiki site, and they have a great spreadsheet that's sortable by due date and by title and all sorts of ways to sort it so that you can keep tabs on what's happening. All the information is there. You can find the letter there. You can find comments, plans there. You can find the particular DDOT staffer to send comments to. And typically they'll update these things, every week or so. And this is something that we keep an eye on, mostly so that you don't have to. Once DDOT's actually sent out a notice of intent for a project, again, this is the very last chance that advocates or community stakeholders have to sort of weigh in on that project, whether it's a new protected bike lane, even something as simple as just putting in a stop sign. As we've seen already, once it's reached that step, there has been quite a lot of process before it. And quite a lot of input. Hey, Ryan. But this is the very last time that you get to weigh in. And so in many cases, it's really important too. So let's say you've got your notice of intent, you're looking at it. What do you do with it? Well, just like with any opportunity for comment, it's good to respond to it. Again, if you don't respond, if you don't go through this sort of formal process, you might as well have not spoken up at all. So what's in a good sort of productive written comment? If you've gone through, 8th grade writing, you can probably imagine the answer to this. This is basically just a very quick written response. They should be short, they should be clear, but make it unique. You should be speaking from your voice. Take a position on the project. If it's to, convert a lane of parking, in the case of G Street Northwest, it's to remove one side of street parking for an entire 3/4 of a mile to repurpose that space for a protected bike lane. Take a position. Say, I support this project. Or if you don't, give your reasons. There's really no need to be formal whatsoever. Often you'll see WABA responding to these things on more formal letterhead, but really an email is sufficient. It's important to recognize who's reading this on the other end, so please be respectful. These are folks who are often doing quite a lot of hard work. Even if you disagree with them at sometimes, they're real people. And in addition to just sort of stating a position, it's helpful to, this is a good opportunity to maybe provide suggestions. Hey, I support this project, but at this particular intersection, I have some thoughts and I have some concerns. This is a good time to raise those, or highlighting sort of unmet needs or maybe other things that the team has glossed over. But we need to take a position, right? So I suppose a question you might be asking is, well, Garrett, how do I get to that position? I have in front of me a letter that explains more or less what's happening, and I have some very detailed comments that are written by an engineer and for an engineer. Where do I even start? Well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that nobody has to be an engineer to have an impact. That's what the letter is for. The staff usually do a good job of summarizing what exactly is happening, what the trade-offs are. Simply writing in to say, I support this project, can have a huge impact. But if you want to get more detailed, you absolutely can. Here are just a few tips for sort of digging in there. So your goal is you want to get a sense of like, is this project good for you and your needs? Is it good for biking? Is it good for people walking? So first off, we need to sort of understand it better, right? So you'll want to grab that letter. You'll want to read that through. You'll also want to grab, if they're there, a set of plans. And on the screen is sort of a very common example of what some of these plans might look like. They're often PDFs and they come in many, many sheets. But some good starting points, you want to get your bearings. These are streets, which means that these may be places that you've been before, or you can easily explore on Google Maps. So pull that up. You'll want to find some sort of familiar streets or landmarks. Somewhere on that sheet will be some sort of legend, which explains like what all the colors mean and what the tiny shapes mean. And using that, you'll get a better sense of like, okay, where in this picture are the bike lanes? What does that small rectangle of small black rectangle mean? Is that a concrete block or just a line stripe? The legend will help you there. You also want to get a sense of what the context is for this project. So if it's a big long line along a corridor, chances are that there's a bike network around it. So if it's a project that is proposing new protected bike lanes, you want to be asking, like, where are people currently traveling around, and how will this augment that? Really, you want to just get a handle on what's actually being proposed, and how that might change things as they are today. Some questions you might want to ask once you have your bearings and you sort of have a sense of where the project is. Here are just a few questions you might want to run through. Presumably this project, a protected bike lane project was begun because there was a need for people to get around by bike on this street. So where do people actually want a bike in the project area? If it's a big long street, it might be a place along that, or that street might be the best way of getting from a place somewhere else to a place further on. But you want to get a sense of, like, how people are using it, or how they will. How will bicyclists and pedestrians actually cross the street? In the case of G Street, this is a beautiful protected bike lane. Sometimes the projects we're looking at actually don't include protected bike lanes on them, but might already have important bike corridors to cross. So how will people actually get across this busy street? How might a plan improve bicycling in the corridor? In the case of protected bike lanes, that's kind of an easy answer, hopefully. And also, is there any extra room or space that could be repurposed for walking and biking? That's a question we'll be diving into in a future session on sort of the geometry of street transformations. And really, does the plan meet your needs? Are there places where it could do that better? So hopefully those will give you a sense of, like, where you sit with a project. And more or less, that should give you everything that you need, jumping back, to write a quick comment in support of it or against it, and propose some suggestions. This is sort of the case for that notice of intent, but it's also the case for every step along the way. You'll just get more or less detail to digest along the way. So, as you can probably imagine, this is going to be a shorter session. We've talked about notices of intent. I want to wrap up real quick and give you all an opportunity to ask some questions. But before I do that, I wanted to sort of highlight four opportunities for you all, especially folks who live in DC, especially folks who travel around Ward 2 and Ward 3. There are 4 great projects that are currently open for comment. They are at the very last step before they get to go in the ground. Once again, you can find all the details, that notice of intent letter and all the plans, up on DDOT's notice of intent wiki. But 4 great projects. G Street, this is again a pretty significant 0.7 miles down a foggy bottom, from 17th Street all the way to Virginia Avenue. There's a very tiny but important piece of Water Street. Water Street and K Street in Georgetown already have a great protected bike lane, but there is roughly a 0.1 mile gap between the Capitol Crescent Trail and where that protected bike lane starts. So DDOT has a plan to fill that gap in with a new protected bike lane. Those comments are actually due quite soon, on May 19th. I encourage you all to, again, take a stab at it and see how that works for you. K Street Northwest, this is something that WABA and a bunch of our community advocates have been working on with our 20 by 20 campaign. This will connect Mount Vernon Square all the way across North Capitol Street to Noma along K Street Northwest. and Northeast, and it'll hook into that lovely protected bike lane on First Street Northeast. And that we're happy to say both of the advisory neighborhood commissions actually support it, which took a lot of work. This is sort of the last step to get it there. And then finally, just announced are some sort of typical painted bike lanes up in Van Ness on Van Ness Street, up in Ward 3, which are due a little ways along. But those are 4 opportunities. I really encourage you to take a look, to put some of these sort of, to see how you do at evaluating those plans and just seeing where you lay. But definitely write a quick email and weigh in. And finally, before I open it up to questions, I just wanted to highlight some of the upcoming trainings. On May 20th, that's next week, a much more interactive training. This was admittedly quite a lot of an information dump, but we'll be talking about sort of not so much the how, but the what of transforming street space. So getting into a question of like, can I fit a protected bike lane there? What are those sort of dimensions and geometries that determine what's possible? After that, we'll be talking about language. When we talk with our neighbors, when we talk with a decision maker, when we talk with other potential allies for building safer streets and transforming our streets to be more bikeable and walkable, what is helpful and inclusive language, and how do we well, practice using that more to be more inclusive. We'll talk about on the 3rd of June sort of some of the tools and tricks that we use to make the case for protected bike lanes or other street safety projects. And we'll give you some practice and a chance to actually take a street that you care about and try out some of these tools. And then on June 10th, we'll be talking about effective tactics. So as I said earlier today, writing in comments on and sort of following the process is just one of the many ways that we can advocate and build, sort of apply pressure to make our streets safer. And there are many other tactics that we can use. And we have a full calendar. I think there's another 3 sessions after that. And you can find them all at wapa.org/fun. That's, I think, enough talking for me. And I welcome you all to ask any questions if you have any. You can go ahead and unmute yourself. I think we have a manageable number. But yeah, there we go. I welcome your questions. Should also say thank you so much for joining.